Hello, everybody, and welcome to another talk. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Christopher Jones, very well known. Now, how do you like to present yourself? Are you a hand reader or a chirologist, or what works best for you?
Yeah, I think the word hand reader is probably the best term because it's so generic, really. I don't really mind the word palmistry. People don't know that actually the word palmistry doesn't mean the study of the hand. The word palmistry is actually a technical term to refer to a book that contains knowledge about the hand. So when you study the history of hand reading, you find out that a palmistry is actually the book that you read, not the hand that you read. So I don't mind calling it palmistry as long as it's understood that palmistry is referring to a body of knowledge
Mm,
rather than a particular approach to the hand. What
okay.
I what I'm very concerned about in the hand reading world is the sort of prediction side of hand, which is emphasised when most people understand the word palmistry. And I don't, as I argue many times in many places, that's not something that can actually be done from the hand. There's a lot of mythology about hand reading, which is associated with the word palmistry. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like hand reading. It's kind of all encompassing. It's a nice. So look,
Mm.
kind of following on from previous interviews, I'd already spoken to Johnny Fincham and Richard Unger
Mm.
and a number of other people who are specialising in kind of the whole. I mean, such a big thing. It encompasses many things. There's a sort of like you say, the predictive. There's a medical. So many things that this system encompasses, and for me the interest came really through the Ayurvedic school. I mean, Ayurveda
Yeah.
introduces hand, not so much hand reading, but hand analysis, looking at the shape and
Yeah.
texture and all these sort of things. That's what got me into the
Yeah.
subject. And then from there, I just reached out to Johnny Fincham, and he kindly did a couple of interviews. And I was just talking to him, and he said, "Look, you should really speak to Christopher as well." So we connected. So here you are. So I think it would be really great if you could just, for the benefit of listeners, if you could just give us a little bit about your background, how you got into us. What's your kind of introduction to this subject?
Okay. Well, I can do that. 1983. That's when I started studying hand reading. I was at university in Norwich, at the University of East Anglia, which is actually where Johnny went to university as well, and studying philosophy and sociology, and was rather disillusioned with the course that I was doing. It didn't help that Margaret Thatcher had just got elected for the second time, so um, everyone was rather depressed about that. But in that process, I started doing yoga and meditation. I went to some yoga and meditation classes, and the woman who's teaching yoga, she drew my astrological chart,
Hmm.
and that was the first time I'd had my birth chart drawn up. And she also said, "Oh, I'm teaching this course on hand reading, so would you like to come?" So I said, "Oh, okay, well, sounds like an interesting thing to do." The hand reading was quite mind blowing, and I was exploring yoga anyway. So I went to this course. It was a 6 week course, I think, something like that. And the process, what was interesting to me, I was 20 years of age when this happened, and what was interesting about learning about hand reading was it basically described patterns of my own experience of myself, which I've been wrestling with and trying to work out who I was. It's a kind of good question to have when you're 20 and 21.
Mm.
And I found that the answers were all on the end of my hands, and I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. So I had a very big impact on me. I actually had my hands read by Dylan Warren Davis, who I
Hmm.
know
Yeah.
you're familiar with too.
Hmm.
So he, at that time, he was the secretary of the Chirological Society. So there was this organisation in the UK called the Chirological Society. He was the most prolific teacher, and he was actually one of my first hand reading teachers. And he read my hands in June 1983. Latterly, probably 10 years later, I re-listened to the recording and I realised that it wasn't actually a very good hand reading. But at the time, it had a big impact on
Yeah.
me. Um, and particularly the discovery of the fingerprint patterns. That was probably the thing that was key for me because I have 7 whorl fingerprint patterns, and
Hmm.
that's quite an unusual distribution of fingerprint patterns. And it was particularly the significance of the whorls in terms of the articulation of that as a descriptor of my experience of myself was
Mm.
incredibly profound. And I actually dropped out of the university at that time, and I decided to study yoga and meditation and hand reading full time. So
Mm.
I did that for the next couple of years, and then I got back. I went back to my university studies, and I got into Oxford University, and I did philosophy and theology at Oxford between '86 and '89. And in that process, in 1988, Dylan had left the society and I became the secretary of the Chirological Society. So I was the Chirological Society secretary from 1989 till 1999, and I came to New Zealand in 2000. So for that sort of 10-year period, I was running the Chirological Society. We had about 120 members usually every year. I was the most active teacher. I ran courses for beginners and intermediate classes. I went all over the country, taught everywhere, into Europe, taught in Europe. So I was basically teaching many people. I had a correspondence course that I'd set up. If you remember C90 tape cassettes, it was on a C90 tape cassette. In fact, if you look up there, you can see those attaché cases up there. All the cassettes of all the things I taught are up on there still. So I was diligent enough to record them all in the 1990s with the thought that if I ever stop doing this and I forget it, I can actually listen to my own tapes. And when I was studying in Norwich, the head of the Chirological Society, which was this character called Terry Jukes, he promoted me to be one of the teachers within the organisation. So I've been teaching hand reading since 1984. But when I was in charge of the society, he basically let me run it the way I wanted to do it. And that process, what happened there was I started investigating all sorts of different kinds of things. So in addition to learning the 5-element approach that he was promoting, I mean, like the first book I ever bought on hand reading was The Laws of Scientific Handreading and Cairo's book. So I got those in like 1983 as my first sort of palmistry books, if you like. And because I was at Oxford, I had access to the Bodleian Library. Now, for those that don't know, the Bodleian Library is a copyright library, so that means every book that's published in the UK has to be deposited into the Bodleian Library. And that's every book, including every book on hand reading. So when I finished my degree, what I decided to do was I was going to go to the library and read every book on hand reading. So that's what I did. And I basically researched, I did a 65,000 word kind of PhD, really, dissertation on the history of hand reading, which basically just went into the libraries and researched backwards to find the oldest text. The oldest text in European languages dates from about 1160. There's nothing older than that in European languages, and that's very important to understand the origins and the history of hand reading as it's practiced in Europe anyway. That basically its primary period was really the 15th century, from about 1400 to about 1500. And in all the manuscripts that are written, handwritten, mainly on goat skin, they're all in the Bodleian Library. And so I had this fantastic opportunity to be a hand reader researching all these documents. So I went and basically spent 5 years researching in the Bodleian Library. And that produced this book called The History of Hand Reading, which I wrote it in 1903. It's been online since 2001. I've had it on a website since 2001. It's kind of a book that I've sort of given to the hand reading world, if you like. I was talking with Andrew Fitzherbert in the 90s. He wrote a fantastic book called The Palmist Companion. And in 1992 it came out. About 94 he wrote to me and said, I don't know what's going to matter. I've only sold 100 copies of the book. I went, 100 copies? I said, I can only think of 20 people who'd want to buy it, so 100's amazing. And it was a bargain. If you try and buy that book now, I've seen it on Amazon, it's like $680 US to buy it. It's an incredibly important book and incredibly rare, but not because a lot of people who want to do hand reading, like you, they want to do medical diagnosis or psychological diagnosis, or whatever they're doing. They don't really know about the history of it, and so I didn't think that would be something that would be a seller. So I basically put it on the internet in 2001 and left it on the internet. It was on Johnny's website for about 10 years. It's now on my website and it's freely available as a kind of complete historical overview of hand reading. And then the funniest thing was in 2018. I got downloaded by some Russians. I found out 2 years ago it's been published in Russian. Wow! For any of your Russian audience there, you can actually get my book on hand reading, the hand reading history, in Russian.
Fantastic.
And I'm in contact with the guy who translated it. He did try. he did sincerely try to get hold of me in 2018, but he couldn't. I wasn't being particularly active at that time. He couldn't find me.
A couple of observations that to start with. Like, firstly, it's interesting that both you and Johnny, obviously, he speaks of a similar kind of genesis of how he got into this, and so I'm presuming it's the same lady that probably
no. I left when I left UEA when I left Norwich in 1986 to go to Oxford. I taught this guy called Dave Gillen how to do handreading, and I left him in Norwich as being in charge of handreading in Norwich. So he took over all my handreading practice in Norwich, and Johnny studied with him first of all.
I was just thinking like that sort of that Indian influence at the beginning, like you both got interested in yoga, so that's that sort of.
Well, he was doing the same yoga. The same yoga. He and I met for the first time in 1989. Actually, we met in 1989 at a residential yoga retreat in Croatia, and that was the first time I met him. And that was a really important meeting. I mean, there's actually a photograph of us together in that particular meeting, but. What was important about that is that how things developed from there, because from about 1990 onwards, he and I we ran these things we called the Advanced Study Group seminars. They were like conferences basically. So we ran these conferences usually twice a year, and we did them for years and years and years. And basically what we did was we get together with the top hand readers, and you could only attend if you presented a paper.
Okay.
So that was the key thing. You had to, so we would choose something like, I don't know, relationships, emotionality, sexuality from the hand. That's our theme for the weekend. So you can present whatever paper you want on, let's say, sex in the hand, or the water line, the heart line in the hand, and what that means about relationships. And I picked that one particularly because that was the seminar where Johnny brought to the conference his paper on what he then called at that time the passion line, which if you've done his course, you probably know about the passion line. It's this angular, as I called it at the time, it's an angular descending upper minor water line. So then we kind of had to have a kind of slightly more elevated languaging, as I was referring to it at that time. But anyway, he presented that that observation about this line at that particular series of meetings, and that's kind of what it was designed to do. It was designed, these sessions were designed to bring people together with their discoveries or researches, and we did ones on mental health, we did ones on physical health, we did psychological stuff, we did emotional stuff. I mean, that's the kind of the remit of the approach that we were taking with the elements. You've got the earth element is health, you've got the water element is relationships, sexuality, you've got the fire element, which is careers and jobs and work, and you've got the psychological element of the air, personality and psychology, and then of course the fifth element, spirituality. So we kind of basically created themes around those particular elemental idioms and did researches in that. So I mean, we've had, you may not have heard of some of these people, but some of them are actually quite well known now. I mean, there's a woman called Talma Brill. She's in Israel. She also studied with Arnold Holtzman, but she did some research into schizophrenics and the Hasidim in Israel, and had articles published in psychiatric journals in Israel. She came and presented her papers on schizophrenia in the hand at our mental health seminar. So she came all the way from Israel to Oxford. That one was. There was another woman called Birgitta Berath who came from Sweden. There was a guy called Johan Hellenborg who lived in Denmark. Laura Thornton, the most famous hand reader no one has ever heard of, and probably the best hand reader no one's ever heard of. She lived in Leeds, so she would come down. So we would get together and we would just exchange these ideas, and that the importance of that was really that during that sort of 6 or 7 year period, Johnny and I very much worked together. So I was doing a lot of the study and the theory and the reading all the books, and he'd be reading loads and loads of hands and going to mind, body, spirit fairs, and as he discovered when he found the passion line, collecting sort of the data, and he'd be going, well, I found all this, what do you think, how do you make sense of it? And I would come up with an idea. So I've got this idea about thing. What do you think, Johnny, from your experience? And we would have this really good relationship with each other, where we were sort of trading the theory and experience. And that was the kind of the cauldron that was in the Chirological Society at that time, and particularly in these seminars. And we did 13 or 14 of them over 7 years. It was a really important really important process.
In the Chirological Society, I mean, what was the sort of what was the background of most people that were members of that? How were they actually using it? Were they were using it as part of another discipline, or they were just purely hand readers and nothing else? You know, what was the kind of general? I know it's you don't want to generalize too much, but what were the kind of their backgrounds? What were they doing with it?
Yeah, good question. I asked the same question many times myself. My observation was that most people didn't do anything with it. And most people, I think it's true. I think most people come to hand reading because they're kind of interested in and they want to learn about themselves. I mean, I find this even now when I'm teaching, you know. So the way I teach now, I teach different kinds of courses. I've got courses for people who are serious about it and who want to become professionals,
Yeah.
but also my introductory course. It's a 6-week course. It's like, hey, come and find out about yourself through your hand in it, and that's very popular. And so I think people think hand reading is going to be really easy. You know, think, oh, it can't be that complicated, surely. You know, and it's like, well, have you thought about how complicated human consciousness is? You know, once you start thinking about that, you kind of realize actually it is going to be complicated. So, as I said, there's typically about 120 members in the society there. Effectively, they were all students of mine. Everybody studied with me because I produced all the journals and I did all the teaching, and you know, so one way or another, they'd done courses with me and they were interested in taking it further. And we produced the journals. Just a handful of them here. Just, you know, we got all these journals that we put out 4 times a year.
Okay.
And that's, you know, there's articles and essays and things in that which are, you know, very.
Are they still available as downloads? Can people access those if they? No, you didn't feel like digitizing them or anything like that. It's all kind of.
It's not at the top of my priority list.
No, just asking.
But I mean, like, some of the material in there is already online. I mean, like my essays on the history of hand reading are in those journals, but that's all online. So some of it's online. But I promise you this, Andrew. I can tell this. I will promise you. Anything that's good in there, I will write about it or I will put it online. Okay. So, but the you know, a lot of that material is really explorative. I think that's a good word for it. You know, I think it's a mistake to think that hand reading really has any scientific basis. And there are a few people who have a kind of quite scientific approach to hand reading. Probably the most successful person in that regard is Martijn van Mensvoort. He's at handresearch.com. He's a clinical psychologist. You know, he's a clinical psychologist who studied hand reading, and he's kind of applied the clinical psychological approach and statistical approach to studying hands, and it's really, really interesting, but it's also really, really dull, and it's really difficult to say anything helpful or useful to people, you know, if you're ending up talking about chromosomal disorders and things like that. So there's so there is no scientific basis for it, and that period in the 90s was very exploratory. So most of the people in the society were just people who were students who were learning hand reading and wanted to know a bit more. And you know, we didn't have the internet in the 1990s, so if you wanted to find out more, you'd have to join a society and get a newsletter. If you look at Richard Unger, he was doing the same thing. So Richard Unger had his Hand Analysis Institute in San Francisco, and he was producing. I think he produced about 8 journals altogether. I contributed to 3 or 4 of them in that time. So Richard Unger, I've known Richard Unger for 35 years, and we used to correspond a lot in the early 1990s. And there's only 4 or 5 people who've ever put out a journal. There's a woman called Isabella Herranz in Spain. That she was a member of the Chirological Society, and she produced her own Spanish version of the Chirological Society journal. And the other guy is Andrew Fitzherbert. Andrew Fitzherbert put out a journal in the 1970s called Palmistry International. So there's only been 4 people that have put out journals and publications on a regular basis about hand reading or palmistry. So it's not a common thing to do. And nowadays, you know, if you go on the internet, it's awash with stuff, you know, and it's
very confusing.
But most of the stuff on the internet isn't particularly good quality. And what we were trying to do in the 1990s was kind of sift through that which didn't work from that which worked, and that's why we had these conflabs together. You know, when you grab together the kind of best chirological minds, even if they've got different approaches, even if they've got different bases from which the starting point is, if you have an open and honest discussion, you will thrash ideas out and you will make new discoveries. And one such example, which is the famous example, is Johnny and the Passion Line. You know, and that genuinely is a discovery that nobody has ever talked about prior to his paper on that. And it's kind of really ironic. There was a book by a guy called Nathaniel Altman. I don't know if you've seen it, but this book by Nathaniel Altman called Sexual Palmistry.
Okay.
It's a terrible book. I'm not recommending it at all. Except what's good about it, it has about 100 photographs of handprints of people with all sorts of sexual interests and hobbies, whether it's transvesticism or BDSM, or whether they're brothel madams or whatever they are. What's extraordinary about it is they've all got this line, the Passion Line.
Right.
But he doesn't talk about it. He talks about all their sexual preferences, looking at other pictures of the hand, and misses this glaringly obvious line.
Wow.
So it's like, how did you miss that? Because most palmists don't discuss things collectively. They do things on their own. And so what you find when you read most palmistry books is they're just rehashing someone else's ideas that they're learning in isolation, and there's no real critical thinking that's going on. And so encouraging that within the Chirological Society was really important. And for me, what's really interesting about it is that many of the people that I taught in the 1990s are still practicing handwriting. So Johnny's the most famous example. He's very well known in the UK. There's a woman called Lynn Steele. She lives in Torquay. She's been reading hands for 35 years, 40 years, something like that now, maybe longer now. I'm not quite sure. But she studied with me in the 1990s. Felicity Booth lives in Northern England. We did an incredibly important pioneering study into the heart line in 1996 that we delineated all the different endings of the heart line, which no one had ever done before. You know, we took a sample of 2,500 handprints and statistically worked out how common the different endings of the lines were. Talma Brill, who I mentioned, you know, she's in Israel. Jenny Hirsch in South Africa, she's one of my students as well. And she's had a lot of books published. So all these people have been continuing as hand readers over that time. And the way that I teach, I really want to encourage people to be innovative in their approach, but from a critical thinking point of view. Not just to accept standard ideas and just repeat Benham and Cairo and all those people. I mean, I mentioned Benham earlier on. I honestly think this is an awful book and shouldn't be read by anybody. It's a terribly terrible book. And it's the same thing with Cairo. I mean, you can't learn anything about hand reading from Cairo's books. Even predictive palmistry, which he's famous for, he didn't use hand reading to do prediction. He used numerology.
Right.
The hand is not a good tool for prediction. But both of those two books, despite them being the first two books I bought, and I keep them for sentimental reasons only.
I'd like to sort of circle back to what you were saying. It's quite interesting about the older book coming, you said around about the 11th century. I'm kind of very interested in the origin stories of these, these systems as well. So if we're saying around 11th century for Western palmistry, what kind of, on these goat skins, what were they actually producing? Were you getting images of lines, or was it more like the Indian tradition where it was more symbols, or what were they actually starting to talk about at that time? Was it shapes or?
No, it was lines. It was
lines.
So the earliest manuscript is called the Edwine Psalter. It was written in Canterbury Monastery in 1160. So I think it's important for people to remember that this is an illiterate time.
Yeah.
Nobody could read and write. The only people who could read and write were people who were in the church, and of course they learnt to read and write in Latin. So everything's in Latin. So the earliest chiromantic texts are in Latin, and they were written by and perpetuated by and continued by members of the church. So that's really, really important to understand, that the origins of hand reading in Europe does not come from the gypsies.
Okay.
It comes from academics, and it comes from the clergy. And the oldest text we have is in the back of a psalter, which is a prayer book that comes from Canterbury Monastery. And so, and what's in that book is like, you know, if you've got a cross here or little lines here or elevations there. And one of the things they're particularly concerned with is the marks of getting promoted to be a bishop. Things like that. So if you have little lines here on this mount here, then it shows you become promoted as a bishop. It's all about stars and crosses. I can just take it a little bit further because it's a bit easier to see that when you get to the 15th century, because there's only that one manuscript from the 12th century.
Okay.
By the time you get to the 15th century, there's about 100. And so we can actually see the scope of hand reading much more clearly, you know, 1400, 1420, 1450, that sort of period. And there's the Meatham manuscript. It was written by a guy who lived in Norfolk. Funnily enough, Norfolk comes up a lot in this story. And the Digby Roll manuscript was written about the same time as well. And what they're concerned with is the same sort of things. They're concerned with the length of your life. They're concerned with how you're going to die.
Yeah.
And they're concerned with riches and honors. So those are the main things that they're concerned with. And this is how they do it. So the first thing that they look for is for triangles. Because the triangle is a really important symbol in Christianity. Because it's a sign of the Holy Trinity.
Yeah.
So if you have a triangle in your hand, that means you are blessed by God.
Right.
So the origin of this notion of looking for triangles in the hand comes from that theological perspective.
Okay.
Similarly, for a cross, what's the significance of a cross? Again, it shows how you're going to die, because Jesus died on the cross. So this what you've got there is an imposition of symbolism that comes from the Roman Catholic Church onto the hand. I mean,
Right.
You'll get the same thing in Ayurvedic traditions as well. You get a particular theological perspective and you apply that to the hand, and then the symbols are interpreted from that particular perspective.
But how about like astrological information? Was that prevalent right at the beginning, or that comes much later?
No, not at all.
But the church has a kind of an astrological. If you go to a lot of these old cathedrals, you'll see all the sort of the symbolism of the 12 zodiacal signs and like kind of hidden astrological symbolism in there. Would that not into it in
Absolutely.
any way?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, because you read all these old texts and they don't mention astrology at all. You know, they call, you know, this is the hill of the little finger. This is the hill of the leech finger. That's called the leech finger. It's not called the Apollo finger. It's called the leech finger because they believe that the ring finger was connected to the heart, which is why you wear a marriage ring on your ring finger. The tradition of wearing a marriage ring on your ring finger is because this ring finger is connected to your heart. And so that's why the medicinal practice was to put the leeches on the ring finger, because they thought that would draw the poison straight from the heart. Exactly. And so that was called the hill of the leech finger, you know, and this was the hill of the thumb. They didn't start putting astrological symbolism onto the hand till about 1450. And when you look at the text from that time, they don't agree with each other.
Right.
They put the planets all over the different places. Sometimes this is the finger of Mars. Sometimes it's the finger of Mercury. You know, there's no agreement about that. That agreement doesn't come until the 16th century, really.
Right.
So
it's a much later.
Much. Yeah. And that's to do with the importance of astrology in the post-Renaissance period. But prior to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is an Italian phenomenon that occurs in the 15th century from 1450 onwards. So after that, that's when the astrology comes into it and becomes very important in the 16th and the 17th centuries. So that's an astrological viewpoint. And if you look at Dylan Warren Davis's book, he talks about Rothman and Wharton and Saunders, who were English astrologers who knew Nicholas Culpeper and William Lilly. And he talks about that in his book about the astrological perspective on handreading. But it's really no different. It's really no different from the theological perspective, because what they do is they just impose an astrological idea onto the hand. So to give you an example, this is my favorite example from Richard Saunders, I think it is. He says, well, obviously, if you see a cross on the mount of the moon, that means the person was born on the 10th of June on a Monday.
Brilliant.
Because, why? Because June is ruled by Cancer. Cancer is ruled by the moon. Okay? So, all right, and a cross, an X, is the Roman numeral for 10. and the moon rules Monday. So if you have a cross here on that part of your hand, oh, it means you were born on the 10th of Monday, the 10th of June. That's your birth date. And they would use that then to draw the chart. People didn't know where they were born in those days. They didn't know what day they were born. They didn't even know how old they were. They didn't know, they had no idea. So they had to kind of find other ways of doing it. And so, but that's a quote that I'm taking you literally from a 17th century manuscript on palmistry about how you find out when someone's born by looking at the lines of their hand. Andrew, it's bonkers. It's completely bonkers. But I mean, it has. I'm not saying it doesn't have its own internal logic, but it's bonkers, you know. And what it is really, and this is something I think this is a really, what you're asking essentially is a really good point, and I think it's really important. And I think, and the importance of that is about how we approach hand reading, because the problem with the medieval chiromancy and the post-Renaissance astrological chiromancy is they're taking an idea and they're imposing it upon the facts. Now, philosophically speaking, that's called a deductive approach. You have an idea and you place it on the hand and you try and work out how it fits with the facts. But the kind of an empiric approach is inductive. It goes completely opposite. It says, well, what have we got in the hand? Let's build the theory up from the facts. Let's start with the facts and then build up the theory. But astrological chiromancy and the Renaissance, pre-Renaissance chiromancy using the theological symbolism is taking, well, of course God exists, and of course the Roman Catholic Church is the most important framework. We have to view everything according to that. Boom, let's impose it on the hand. And they did that in the 17th century. Astrology was studied at university. Everything was considered through an astrological lens, including medicine. You know, Newton was an astrologer before he was an astronomer. Astrologers were called mathematici. A mathematician. You had to be a mathematician to be able to do the calculating for astrology. And so they were all tied up together. That was a kind of paradigmatic worldview, and that explains also why astrology and hand reading and palmistry and alchemy all kind of fell away from about 1680, is because the worldview changed, the paradigm changed, the way we looked at things. The rise of science turned alchemy into chemistry, turned astrology into astronomy, and hand reading just fell off the chart completely and was ignored for 200 years.
Well, what's the date when the two actually really marry? So when do we actually see astrological interpretation and palmistry become one, inseparable? When do they actually become, in the West, when is that tradition actually united? So you'd have your palm read and it would be, you know, it would almost like an astrological reading via the palm, or did that never?
No, never.
It never really happened.
Never. No, never at all. Astrology, hand reading treatises in those. I mean, the time that probably the most nearly attempted to do that was in the 17th century, and the one palmist, astro-palmist, who did that was a guy called George Wharton. Johannes Rothman, and he would draw a chart and then draw a picture of the hand in the middle of it, but the problem with that is that they didn't have photographs, they didn't take handprints, you know, and so they do these little drawings of the hand, and you can't rely on someone's drawing of a hand to make that. Oh, that's really what that line was doing in that. You've got no evidence for it. So they attempted to do that, but I don't think they were serious about it, because, you know, if you look at people like Paracelsus or Robert Flood, the amount of stuff they wrote on chiromancy, what they called hand reading in those days, is tiny. They wrote loads on astrology and a little bit on palmistry. It was really not. It was not an important subject to most people, even if they were astrologers. And I think that's fair. And I think that's fair because astrology is a much bigger subject. And I'm not denying that if you study astrology and if you study someone's birth chart and you study someone's hand, you will find a big overlap between the views. And that's something that the SSPP used to do. There's another organisation in the UK which went from about 1945 to about 2005, which was founded by Noel Jaquin, one of the pioneers on fingerprint analysis. And they did what they called correlation evenings, and I used to go to their conferences, and that's where I met lots of these other hand readers. And on the Friday evening, they would have a volunteer would get up and put their handprints and an astrological chart and a sample of their handwriting, and all the different hand readers and astrologers would then give us an analysis of this person in front of them, in front of the whole room. And it was always amazing how much overlap there was. As I mentioned, I've been, had my first astrological chart done in 1983, and I am an astrologer too, I have long wanted there to be some kind of overlap, and investigated it thoroughly in the 1980s and found it completely wanting. And I think that really the answer is that they are two different disciplines, and they have very different provenances. The one thing that's about hand reading that it's not good at is timing. You really can't do timing on the lines of the hand. And if you insist that you will, if you take something like the lifeline or the major earth line and you time that line is no more than usually about 10 centimeters long, which means if you assume that people live to 100, that means you've got 1 millimeter per year that you could calibrate that line, which basically means, however, even if you were able to get that absolutely accurate, and that's a big assumption, the nearest you could get to from a dating point of view would be to within a year. So when you actually look at what palmists do from the lines of the hand, they'll say, oh, in your early 20s, or about when you're about 50, or something like that, which is really kind of vague. Astrology is like, on the 6th of February 1999, this is going to happen to you. I mean, because astrology is based around timing. It's all about the movements of the planets at very specific times. What its particular forte is timing, the precision of that. And if you practice astrology at all, and you do transits, or you do progressions, or you look at people's charts over a time, and I've done this for 40 years, looked at my own chart, I can map every significant event in my life, and it correlates with significant astrological transits, and not just around 1999, like literally on this date until this date, and astrology has that advantage because it is the study of the interface of time into this three-dimensional experience that we live in.
Just since we spoke a couple of weeks ago, just prior to this talk, it kind of reignited my interest in some of the early astrological texts in India, and I contacted a professor who's been working on particularly like Indian marks, and they're looking at the whole body. They're delineating from like lines on the forehead, the hands, the feet. It's basically the whole body is used to try and work out, what predict things or medical. So I was looking through the book, and just to see whether he had sort of focused in on any areas of timing. And he was saying that although you can find texts around the sort of 1st century AD, they're talking about these marks, but the bulk of the book, or the volume of the book, is about astrological interpretation. The section on the actual reading the body parts is very, very small. It's like maybe one chapter, and this gets repeated and repeated. And again, like you're saying, it seems nothing really codifies until about the sort of 15th, 16th century, and then the system really starts to come into focus, and they bring a lot more detail into, but again, they're still not using you don't see so much about the main 4 lines in the hand. It's more about symbols, and again, like the fingerprint interpretation. So I'm sort of beginning to think now, I wonder how much of this is really ancient, and how much of it is much more of a modern interpretation. Those pictures that I'd sent you of some of the palm plants, that were showing like the conch shells and the peacock feathers and the whorls and all the chakrika, the discus on the fingers. And like he says in there, it goes into all kinds of things. It's not just the palm prints, it's how the body, the voice, the quality of the voice, the complexion, how the person moved, how smoothly they moved, and all these things are all part of the analysis.
Well, if you have a good hermeneutic, you can actually do all of that from the hand. That's what's interesting. That's what's interesting about the hand as a sort of microcosm of the whole physical being. The hand is kind of, from a medical diagnostic point of view, which is, I guess, is the emphasis you're putting on there, that's been a very long tradition. In European traditions, they call that physiognomy, and their approach to physiognomy was using astrological symbolism to associate different parts of the body with astrological planets. And if you look at somebody like Culpeper, all his herbal remedies are to do with the planetary influences and the 4 humors and stuff like that. So there's a long legacy of that, but very specifically, if you look at the hand as a metaphor for the whole person, then what you're able to do, if you have the correct interpretive tools, you're actually able to tell an awful lot about the person at all those levels that you described, physically, emotionally, psychologically. And the one I always emphasize to my students is, well, what job do they do? You know, like it's very difficult and possibly dangerous for hand readers to do a sort of health diagnosis from the hand. And I don't really teach that stuff because I don't think most people are qualified to do that. And I think people can make big errors of judgment, or they can overstate claims about health analysis from the hand. So I'm really wary about that approach. I mean, there is some good medical stuff that you can know from the hand, whether you've got discolorations like palmar erythema, or you've got nail conditions like digital clubbing. But the material of that comes from medical science. That doesn't come from palmistry, you know. So if you're going to do medical diagnosis from the hand, let's borrow that knowledge from the people who really tested it, not some spurious 15th century tradition which may be really old but may or may not have any basis to it. Again, my emphasis is to go with what's empirically shown to be true. So that I mean, I think if we're going to build a hand reading that is going to be successful and is going to be useful for people, it has to be empirically testable. If it's empirically testable, it therefore becomes verifiable. And if it's verifiable, then it can be adequately taught to other people and grown and expanded. And that's certainly my experience in terms of people that I've taught over the years. So, but when you've got the hand, you know, looking at that, you can see there's a relationship between their gut health and, you know, their marital status and the relationship they have with their children, and possibly even the job that they do, because all these things are interconnected. We are holographic, multi-layered, complex, interreflective human beings, and if you're going to try and describe that, you need to have a sophisticated vocabulary to do that. And that's really the advantage of the elements earth, water, fire, air, and ether, or akasha, because it gives that kind of vibrant interpretive metaphor that allows people to make the connections between these things. And you know, I know people who've had hand readings with Johnny are incredibly impressed by what he does. And what he has there, he has the ability, he has a structured approach to studying the hand, which, you know, came about through studying with me in the Chirological Society, plus his own intuitive relationship to the elements and the rapport he creates with his clients. But when you have a great structure, you can apply, you will take it with your own interpretive approach and your ability to connect with the client whose hands you're reading, and you will be able to accurately describe what's going on for them in a way that isn't purely subjective, and in a way that doesn't require any kind of psychic or intuitive abilities, or, you know, ascended masters whispering in your ear or something like that. It's actually empiric, you know, and so what that happens then is then, you know, we have these conferences and Johnny will say, well, I've discovered this, and he'll put it to me, and I'll go, well, that sounds interesting, let me test it out, and then we can all experiment with it and see if it has, you know. I'm trying to contrast that with an approach where you take an idea and you superimpose it upon the hand, as opposed to the approach where you look at what's on the hand and then build up an idea from that. That latter approach allows for that kind of flexibility and that kind of development of those ideas. And I think it's a kind of reason why hand reading palmistry died out in the 17th century, was because it didn't have that empiric basis. And so from my point of view, when I look at hand reading, you know, and as I said, I've read every book published in the UK going back to 1160. You know, there's really nothing anything that was written before about 1920 is really not worth the paper it's written on.
Right.
And that's primarily because of an approach that's being taken, and the way that people are looking at the hands. Because when they revived palmistry in the 19th century, they just copied the old stuff from the 17th century and used the mounts and the planets and those sort of things. So where you start getting a difference is when you start getting interest in the fingerprints.
Yeah.
And the term fingerprints, the correct term for fingerprints, the study of fingerprints, is actually dermatoglyphics. And the term dermatoglyphics was coined in 1926. So that before that term, that word didn't exist. They did talk about fingerprints. And the first palmist to really study fingerprints was a guy called Noel Jaquin. And he was an enormously important pioneer in the story of hand reading. Probably one of the three most important palmists of the 20th century, because he was the first person to describe the psychological significance of the fingerprint.
But Richard put me onto that. Richard Unger. He said you want to try and get hold of that book. I managed to find a digital copy online, and it was really interesting reading those early interpretations. He was doing only like 3 or 4 different types of prints, but I thought it was pretty good, pretty concise.
And he wrote 9 books, and they are all up here. All of his books are up there. Yeah, his primary interest was in microbiology. He was a microbiologist. He was into microscopes, and he was really interested in the sort of the physiological significance of fingerprint patterns. That's kind of what he started with. And he would take handprints and look at them under a microscope, and he would look at the skin ridges and the deterioration of the skin ridges in particular disease conditions, and in things like infections like malaria. So he was interested at a sort of biological level, but he couldn't avoid recognizing the psychological significance of fingerprint patterns as well. But he actually doesn't say an awful lot, and as you quite rightly said, he only talked about 5 fingerprint patterns, and in fact there are actually more than 5 fingerprint patterns. He doesn't really go into them in great detail, but I always acknowledge Jake Quinn because he's the first person to really talk about fingerprint patterns. And that really is one of the big differences between Cairo and Benham and modern handreading. So if you look at Benham's book, he doesn't talk about fingerprint patterns at all. He goes on about fingertip shapes. He talks about the mounts. There is one drawing he has in this book where he says, well, if you look very closely, you can see the ridges make a little triangle formation, the triradius as it's called. He actually does a drawing of that, but he doesn't notice the fingerprint patterns. And if you look at Cairo's books are great because they've got lots of handprints in them. He's got all these amazing handprints of famous people that he's taken prints of. And if you look carefully at the prints, you can actually see
them, but it's not even mentioned. That's strange, isn't it?
But he doesn't even mention them. So and what's interesting about those books, those authors. So Benham's book was written in 1900, and Cairo was really active in London in the 1880s and 1890s. And at exactly that same time, Francis Galton is defining fingerprints. So Francis Galton is the cousin of Charles Darwin. He's a geneticist, and he's interested in fingerprint and morphology and stuff like that. So he wrote his first book in 1892 called Fingerprints, and then a second book in 1895 called Fingerprint Directories. Sufficiently that Arthur Conan Doyle picked up on it and has Sherlock Holmes detecting a murderer by fingering the fingerprint pattern. And also the other one is so the point, the literary people at the time knew about fingerprints, even though the palmists themselves didn't. So it's kind of like really interesting.
As I say, you kindly sent me a copy of your interpretations of the Dermatoglyphs book, which was originally 1992. So you're currently actually in the stage of you're reworking that book. It's coming out again. It's going to be released in, I think you said early next year, is it? Coming out in
the book I have written, and it's with the publishers right now and is due out in January 2026. It's a book very specifically on the fingerprint patterns. And you mentioned that I wrote that book in 1991. I could probably say a little bit about that as well if you like, but when I was learning handreading myself, so that early 80s time is when I was going to consider myself to be learning it, and the early 90s is when I'm starting to disseminate and teach it. But one of the things that I thought was really missing from everybody's tradition was a really decent study of the fingerprint patterns. There was no clear indication, for example, how common fingerprint patterns were. Even if some people label, enumerated the different types of pattern, nobody had kind of like, well, of course you get whorls on. They're very common on this finger, but you hardly ever see them on this finger. There were no statistics about that. So I did as part of my diploma studies for the Chirological Society. This was my advanced thesis for my advanced diploma. I did a survey of handprints, and I collected the stats for the different distributions of fingerprint patterns, so I could work out how common different fingerprint patterns occurred on different hands. And also how many types of fingerprint patterns there are. Now, if you look at Francis Galton, he defines there are 4 main fingerprint patterns. The world. Maybe I can pull up a screen of it. With
put up your slides.
That might be useful to see. So we're talking about this, so people can see what we're talking about. So this is a general description of the different types of patterns. So Galton basically defined the three main fingerprint patterns as being the arch, which is like a humpback bridge, you can see there at the top. And then the loop, you've got this sort of rounded method like that. And what's notable is you get this little triangle formation here called a triradius. And the triradius is located on the side. And there's only one of them. And then you've got a whorl, which is a spiral shape, but the whorl has got two triradii. So this differentiation of the fingerprint patterns into these types, where you have an arch which has no triradii, the loop which has one, and then the whorl which has two triradii. That classification system was developed by Francis Galton in 1892. So that's the basis of that, but they're not the only prints. In fact, you get other prints. You get a tented arch, and here you can see that the triradius is in the middle. So that little triangular formation is in the middle, and then you've got the ridges going up and over it. You have a double loop or twinned loop where there is the loop going in one direction and a loop going in the other direction.
I always think that looks a bit like the yin yang symbol. It always reminds me of the yin yang symbol.
I totally agree with you, and that's a very good way of interpreting that particular pattern. And then the sixth most common pattern is the peacock's eye, which is actually just a variation of the whorl. So you've got the spiral shape in the middle, and you can see there are two triradii here and here on the side like that. And then with the loops can go in two different directions. So there's an ulnar loop which goes that way, and then the radial loop goes in the opposite direction. So they're basically the same pattern, but they just point in different directions. And so that's important when it comes to interpretation. So what it turns out is there are only 7 types of patterns, and those 7 patterns account for 99% of all fingerprint patterns all over the world, but they're not distributed equally. Right. So, for example, most people have loops. So, in a British population, the loops occur on about 63% of digits, and whorls are about 20%. Yeah. And arches are about 8%. And but in the Maori population in New Zealand, whorls occur on about 65 to 68%. Yeah. So the whorls are much more common amongst certain populations around the world, and so there's so the distributions of fingerprint patterns are different amongst different people and different ethnicities. And so that was something that was discovered in the anthropological investigation into fingerprint patterns in the 1920s and 1930s. And what they noticed is that certain patterns occur more commonly on the hands of women. So arches are more common on the hands of women, right? And radial loops are more common on the hands of men. So they found that. And what's also significant is there is an inverse relationship between the arch and the whorl. So if you have more arches in a population, there will be less whorls, and vice versa.
They're like sort of two opposites. And
yes,
there's somewhere in between the two.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very good way of thinking about it. And so this is all studies that were done by scientists, by medical geneticists, by anthropologists, by psychologists. They're collecting all this data about the fingerprint patterns from about the 1920s right through to the 1970s is the biggest 50-year period in which fingerprints were studied. And they were interested in the significance of these patterns. And you can't give equal weight to each of these fingerprint patterns. Like half the people you meet will have 7 or more loops on 50% of people. So if you got loops on the hand, that's kind of a normal experience, and that describes the sort of social and gregarious orientation that people have. And so if you have 7 loops, you fit in really well. You do well at school. You're part of a team at work. You've got a good social friends. You've got a sense of community. You have a sense of belonging, and that's very easy for you if you have lots and lots of loops. Right. If you have 7 out of 10 arches or 7 out of 10 whorls, not so much. You feel very different. And what we've noticed is, for example, people with lots of whorls tend to be what are now called neurodivergent people. So you find lots of people with lots of whorls are on the Aspergic or autism spectrums or have other sort of neurodivergent attributes because they think differently. You'd expect to see in a normal person's hand, you'd expect to see maybe two whorls, maybe three whorls on a hand.
Yeah.
So that's quite normal. But if you start seeing 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 whorls in a hand, you've got a much more a different emphasis in the way that you're wired, because the fingerprint pattern shows something of the sort of fundamental wiring that you have. It's a very intrinsic thing.
I was going to say, do you see any kind of like primal patterns? So do you think that one of these is kind of like the original primal one, and the others have kind of diverged from that primary pattern, or do you think that they're all naturally, they're just running concurrently, in some areas they're more prominent than others?
Yeah, I think that I mean, when they started studying this stuff in 19th, early 19th century, early 20th century, they did have that kind of slant on it. And they did try to look for sort of like some commonality like that, but there really isn't. There's just different distributions of fingerprint patterns amongst different peoples. You know, there are only 3 creatures in the world that have fingerprint patterns. There's the human primate,
Yep.
the other primates like chimpanzees and gorillas, and one other animal that has fingerprint patterns is the koala bear.
Oh, amazing.
And nobody knows why. It's really weird. But they are genetic indicators, and so what you tend to find is that fingerprints tends to run in families. So I mentioned before, I've got 7 whorl fingerprint patterns. My father had 8 whorl fingerprint patterns. His mother had 8 whorl fingerprint patterns. So if you have a certain disposition of fingerprint patterns, you will probably find that they're running in the families.
Right.
But what you need to know is how common it is to find certain patterns. Or alternatively, how rare it is to find certain patterns. So the tented arch only occurs on 1% of all fingerprint patterns. It's an incredibly rare pattern.
Right.
The double loop occurs on about 5% of fingerprint patterns. The central pocket loop, or peacock's eye, occurs on about 3%. So it's, you know, these ones are much more rare. You don't normally see more than one of these in a hand.
So you've got, you said you've got about, you said you had 6 or 7 whorls? 7 whorls. Okay, so how significant is do the fingers that don't have that pattern, do they become more important or less important? You know, let's say you had all loops and you had one whorl on there, does the whorl suddenly become the real finger of interest, or does it?
That is the main bulk of my book, explaining exactly that, and that's a really good question, Andrew, because I think that's the really important thing. So here's how I approach assessment of fingerprint patterns. So first of all, you have to diagnose them correctly. You have to kind of classify the fingerprint correctly. If you can't work out what the fingerprint pattern is, you're falling at the first hurdle. So you really do need to have a clarity around those classifications, and they're easy to see when you've got a diagram like that. So I spend the first part of the book sort of explaining how to identify a fingerprint pattern, what the characteristics are, and then talking about the statistics and the distributions of them. But the second part of the book is how to interpret those things. So following on the work of Noel Jaquin and following on from the work of Beryl Hutchinson, when I originally wrote this in 1991, I basically created a profile of the significance of each fingerprint pattern on each finger. Now, there's a caveat to that, because some fingerprint patterns don't occur on some of the fingers at all, ever. And the radial loop, the tented arch, particularly those two, don't occur on the little finger and don't occur on the thumb. And some patterns are incredibly rare on the ring finger. And so there's a diversity and a range of commonality of the prints, and you really need to know that, because if you see a pattern on a finger that kind of isn't kind of supposed to be there, then it becomes really important. So there's this guy called Andres Washington who's in the US, and he's a statistical forensic dermatic lyricist, and he's very interested in assessing the rarity of a particular fingerprint pattern. And he has his whole thesis, his whole life's work, he's about 75, has been about the more rare the fingerprint pattern, the more significant it is to that person. So his hypothesis is, if you're a rare and interesting and very different person, you're going to have a very rare and different and interesting fingerprint pattern. And that's exactly what he proves on his website. So he's got the fingerprints of John Lennon. John Lennon's got a very particularly weird fingerprint on his index finger. Jimi Hendrix, very weird fingerprint pattern on his left hand index finger. Of course, Jimi Hendrix was left-handed. Malcolm X is another one, the black rights activist. Martin Luther King, Eisenhower. He goes through all these different examples of really interesting, mainly American characters, because he's got access to the FBI records. He's got access to a database of 17 million fingerprint patterns, so he really knows his stuff when it comes to distributions of fingerprints. My statistical survey only goes up to 2 million. I'm sorry, but
still pretty.
Still pretty, yeah. I mean that's from Scotland Yard. It's not my own personal one, but I have included that in the book. So the sample, when I'm talking about distributions of fingerprint patterns, there's my own study, then there's Scotland Yard statistics, and I've included all of those in the book, so you can actually get an idea of how common or how rare the different fingerprint patterns are. So that's a really important thing. How common is the fingerprint pattern, and therefore, if it's rare on a particular finger, then it becomes much, much more important. And which finger it's on is also therefore really important from an interpretive point of view. So if we look at the fingers in terms of different, I call them identities, because these are the fingers are to do with the mind. The palm is the body, the fingers are the mind. So the way that we understand the fingers is in terms of what impact it has on cognitive processes, on psychological characteristics of that human being. And the fingerprints are right on the top phalange of the finger. So that's the earth, water, fire, air section of the phalanges. So it's to do with the way that conceptual processes occur within the different digits and representation of the different digits. So the index finger is to do with your personal identity. So the fingerprint pattern on this finger is probably the most important fingerprint pattern of all. And what's interesting about that is this fingerprint pattern, the fingerprints are more diverse on this finger than they are on the other fingers. So I mentioned how there were 7 fingerprint patterns. There are some fingerprint patterns that only significantly occur on this finger, notably the tented arch. It occurs on 4% of index fingers and almost not at all on any of the other fingers. And the radial loop fingerprint pattern almost only occurs on this finger. It occurs on about 22% of index fingers and almost no other digits, and never seen on the little finger or the thumb. So there are some fingerprint patterns that only occur there. And then all the other fingerprint patterns, the other 5, occur in different distributions. So the only finger that gets all 7 fingerprint patterns manifested on it is the index finger. And then remember, I said that those 7 patterns only cover 99% of fingerprint patterns. There are some really weird fingerprint patterns.
Well, what are we looking at? What would be something that you've never seen before, like a sort of a...
Would you like me to show you an example? I can't really discuss that without showing you an image. But maybe if I can do that. Can you see this one?
Okay, that looks like a tented arch. They are tented arches, aren't they?
I know it looks like a tented arch, doesn't it? It's not.
So what's differentiating that apart from...
Hang on. All right. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
All right. So what this is a really, really peculiar genetic, really weird formation of the fingerprints called ridges off the end syndrome. Right. And probably the easiest thing for you to do is to compare it to your own fingerprint patterns. What you find when you look at fingerprint patterns is they all curve around before they get to the top of the finger. Whether it's a whirl or a loop or whatever it is, they all curve around. These ones do not. They basically go zing, they go right off the edge of the digit, which is why they're called ridges off the end syndrome. That's not my name. That was P.J. David, 1971, who first discovered these fingerprint patterns. But this is an extraordinarily weird, anomalous fingerprint patterns. The woman whose handprints these are, I actually lived with her. She was one of my students. And this was an amazing discovery. I took her handprints and read these before I knew about these particularly weird fingerprint patterns. And so it was amazing to discover the paper in the Bodleian Library when I was studying it, to find out what they represent. What they mean is we don't know. So again, this is a point I want to indicate about fingerprint patterns. Having one example of a particular fingerprint pattern does not give us enough information to make a hypothesis as to its significance. Now, I could describe her personality, I can tell you what she's like, I could make some conjectures about that, But unless I find someone else who's got the patterns and they've got the similar characteristics of personality, I can't confirm that that's actually a true hypothesis or not. And I've never met anybody else with this. But what is known about this pattern is it's genetic, and it's a very peculiarly weird genetic formation that occurs in particular people's hands. And I'll just show you this as an example again. These are all her fingerprints.
That's loops.
Yeah, she's got loops on the thumb, exactly. Yeah. So she's got loops on the thumb.
Oh.
Fine, nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly good loop. But all the other fingerprint patterns just go weirdly off the palm. So there are definitely some very, very strange fingerprint patterns, and some of which, like this, are unclassifiable. So they are in a category of their own. Let me just show you a couple of other ones. So these are all the really weird fingerprint patterns. These are all in my book. I discussed them all in my book about and how often they occur and so on. But a Newton loop, yeah, a Newton loop. So a Newton loop is an incredibly rare pattern. It occurs in 0.86% of male fingerprint patterns. And this is the thing. So it's a really rare fingerprint pattern, right? And it's so rare you'd expect never to. I've hardly ever seen any of these. Maybe seen one or two. But Malcolm X has got two of them. This is actually Malcolm X's thumbprint. So you kind of you get a really weird fingerprint pattern like this, and you get a really unusual character like Malcolm X in terms of his political activity in the 60s, and you go, hang on a minute, this is an exemplar of a certain kind of behavior. Again, we can't be only going to speculate because we don't get until we get someone else who confirms that. We don't really know if we're taking the empiric process. But I do like noting the hypothesis that Andreas Washington has, which is if it's an unusual fingerprint pattern, it shows something unusual about the person.
Yeah. So somebody walks in and says, right, look, I want you to do a hand analysis. You're looking at all the regular stuff, the shape, the texture, the strength, the primary lines. How much is this a part of your overall? So in other words, how much weight do you put on the fingerprints when you're doing an analysis?
What's more important in the hand? The things that change, the things that change quickly, the things that change slowly, or the things that don't change at all. A bit like saying, what are the characteristics about which you can do nothing about? You can do nothing about your genetics.
No.
You are born in a body. What the hand represents is your physical body. What the fingerprints represent is this genetic construct that's been created by your parents coming together and producing a physical body that is you. And you're constrained by that genetics. You're constrained by that will give you height, weight, dispositions to diseases, maybe particular skills and abilities by virtue of what you've inherited from your parents. So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So we are largely determined by the genetics. Now, if you want to say that's fate and you've got a problem with that, well, that's go and argue with your genetics, But that's one part of the dice. The other part is the nurture and the experiences you've had with your life, and then the third part of that is the choices that you make, reconciling what you've intrinsically been given and the experiences you've had in your life, and how you make that work or not work together, and that's called your life. So when you're looking at a hand, you're looking at a conflation of those three things. You're looking at the genetic stream is essentially the fingerprint patterns. I don't just restrict it to genetics. I say it's a karmic stream as well, because there's a really deep patterning that exists in the fingerprint patterns, which does not change through this lifetime. It denotes patternings of your consciousness, the way that you think, the way you understand the world, your personal psychology, which will be with you throughout your whole life. But the lines of the hands change, and the lines change according to your experiences in life. So when you start looking at the lines of the hand, that tells you how the person's experiencing themselves, what they're doing, and how things are affecting them, whether it's an emotional situation or stress or physical health problems. The lines will change. So if you want to know what kind of diseases you're going to get, look at your fingerprint patterns. If you want to know what diseases you've got, look at the lines. And you may get diseases that are not your genetic disposition to get, because you eat badly. If you have well fingerprint patterns, you're much more likely to get heart disease and die of a heart attack. I'm 62. I've had 2 heart attacks. And I go, oh yeah, that's kind of, I expect to have heart attacks. That's kind of inevitably what I've kind of got. And my mother had 10 loop fingerprint patterns, and loop fingerprint patterns are associated with presenile dementia and Alzheimer's. And I told her in 1991, I said, well, you've got loops, you know, you're going to get Alzheimer's. She said, oh, I didn't want to know that. I said, well, you did ask me to make a prediction for you. And she did. And then it's like there are dispositions. Now, whether you're going to get a heart attack, if you smoke and you overwork and you drink heavily and you don't do any exercise, you're going to get heart attacks. And more likely to have that if you have wells. And so there are things you can do to ameliorate your health. It's not predetermined, but you've got a disposition, and there's nothing you can do about that. You know, that's why doctors ask you, and what did your parents die of, and what diseases run in your family, because the likelihood is you will have that same physiological weakness as well. Ceteris paribus, you know. So to answer your question, how I look at the hand, the fingerprints are the most important thing to look at the hand.
Right. I'm got an interest in iridology as well, and we say the same thing. I mean, these patterns are formed around the same sort of like fourth or fifth month of utero. These patterns are already set in the iris. But what we say
16 weeks, between the 12th and 16th week of gestation.
Do we sort of say, like, okay, here's your genetic pattern that's in the iris, but there is a constitutional type, but you can go beyond your iris pattern. In other words, if you're aware that that's your tendency, it's not your fate. You don't have to be fated to die.
No, exactly. I liken it to a game of cards. You get dealt the cards. You don't get a choice about which cards you got dealt, but you do get a choice of how you play them. And that's the kind of the key thing, I think. You know. But in terms of like your question about the different significance of the different features, I basically, and this was the importance of the thesis that I wrote in 1991, which is the book, The Interpretation of the Body, which is the basis of the book that come out now. If we're going to look at the hand, we really need to start with the things in the hand that are most fundamental and most core and foundational for someone's experience. And that is the hand shape, the skin texture, and the fingerprint patterns. So the hand shape really denotes something of your constitution. There's a lot of weird misunderstandings about hand shape. I don't really know why. It's probably to do with Darpontigny and Benham and people coming up with strange ideas. But the shape and size of your hand is a function of the shape and size of your body. So if you want to know about your constitution, the hand shape will tell you about your constitution. The skin texture is part of the skin ridge patterns, and it's important to remember that there are fingerprint patterns on the palm as well as on the fingerprint. So there are palmar patterns as well as digital patterns. And the quality of the skin texture is really important as an analysis for that. So you asked me how much of my hand reading is based around that. I can do a 1 hour hand reading on hand shape, skin texture, and fingerprints. And, you know, if a hand reading is less than an hour, I will only talk about the fingerprint patterns.
Wow.
And what's significant about that is that you will get so much information about that person, about how they live their life, and it's so fundamentally true. And the important thing about it is it doesn't kind of matter whatever else they do. They will always be like that because those patterns are unchanging. And that's the significance of fingerprints. One, they're unique. Everybody has a unique set of fingerprint patterns. There's nobody who has the same fingerprint patterns as you. Not even identical twins have identical fingerprints.
It's the same with the iris,
Yeah. So it's uniquely you. And in particular, the fingerprint pattern that's on your index finger is the one that's uniquely to do with you. It's the most diverse of all the fingerprint patterns, and this finger shows.
But it's always the finger that we point with as well, isn't it? It's like, so you don't see people going like this. It's like this.
No, exactly. Not unless they're drinking a cup of tea. And the other thing about the fingerprint pattern is, you know, everybody knows that fingerprint patterns are unique, and everybody knows the fingerprint patterns don't change. So the fact that they don't change, they represent a constant in your life, but they don't represent what you think. They represent how you think about what you think. And the analogy I like to give, and this is only an analogy, but it's the best analogy I've got because I can't think of a better way to apprehend it. The way I see the fingerprint patterns is the kind of crystallization of consciousness in the physical form of the body. So when we're born, it's like our soul, if you want to use that languaging, sort of condenses into the physical body and leaves an impression. If you think about the way when the tide goes out, you go down to a beach when the tide's out, you see all the ripple effects in the sand, that the moving water has created these ripple effects in the sand. That's not the sand, that's the effect of the ocean, the energy in the water leaving an impression in the sand. And that's exactly what I think is the relationship between consciousness and the physical body, and what the fingerprints are representing. And they represent consciousness, because if you look at the fingertips, the most sensitive part of the finger is the droplet on the fingertip, and that droplet occurs, if you look at it carefully, you'll see that that droplet occurs right in the middle of your fingerprint pattern.
Right.
The fingerprint pattern is exactly at the place where there's most concentrated nerve endings in the tip of your finger, and that tip of your finger's nerve endings is the connection between the outside world and your consciousness. It is the interface of consciousness and the external phenomena of reality. One of the biggest things when you read someone's hand is, if you're able to see their fingerprint patterns and understand that dynamic, they go, like I did when I was 20, when I found out I had 7 worlds, I went, oh my God, that's exactly what I'm like. I feel completely seen. I feel completely understood for the first time. And that's the repeated experience of people who have their hands read. But there's nothing to do with fortune telling, there's nothing to do with prediction, there's nothing to do with timing, there's nothing, those things are completely irrelevant. Can you describe the psychological relationship that person had with their mother when they were a child? Can you describe whether or not that person experienced, I don't know, childhood sexual abuse or something like that? Those things are very easy to see from the hand, and that's fine. Can you tell me what job they do? That's really important. So, because if you can work out what job they do, they either do that job, or they have done that job, or they don't. And it's actually very easy to figure out the kind of careers that people should have, and the kind of jobs that they've done, the kind of skill sets that they've got. And it's a very easy and objective way of verifying whether your system is accurate. Now, you'll notice that if you look at most palmistry books, and Andrew Fitzherbert is the exception to that, they don't talk about career. They don't talk about jobs. They don't talk about that. They don't tell you how to teach that, to see that from the hand. They're much more concerned in the meaning of an island in the middle of your lifeline that might indicate that you've had a bucolic liver. It's kind of like, you don't know, and you're not medically qualified to say so, and they'd have to find out from someone else, and they couldn't possibly tell you unless they have a third-party diagnosis by a professional medic. So the problem with all of those things, and this is again the problem with prediction. My biggest problem with prediction is this, because people always say, oh, but it was really accurate. Okay, people say my predictions, my handwriting predictions are really accurate. This is how I would want to test that. Okay, I would say, okay, take the handprint of the person when they're 20, write a report, make the predictions down, see them again 30 years later, take their handprints again, see if the hands have changed, then ask them, I said this in that, did those events happen on those dates as I said? There is no palmist that has ever done that, ever. And so there is no corroboration of what they've said. And that's making no imputation about whether they're lying or not lying, or being truthful or not truthful. I'm saying it's not verified. If you want to claim, and the thing is, there's an unverifiability about that. Why? Well, most palmists don't do palmistry for 30 or 40 years, first of all. Second of all, most palmists don't take handprints, so you've got no external record of what the hand was like at a particular point in time to compare it to later. And ironically, I'm using this example slightly facetiously, but I actually have got handprints of people that I took in 1983, in 1984, in 1985. And I went to the UK recently, and I met up with those people and took their handprints again. So I've got collections of handprints that I have taken 40 years apart. So I can see how the hands have changed in that time. But if you're going to claim that you can do predictions on the hand, show me the empiric backup for that. That's what I want to say. Same thing. And Liz Hallows is really concerned. If you're going to make a psychological claim about a personality, back that up with empiric evidence. And she did a dissertation, a master's thesis at Queensland University exactly on that particular topic. There's a guy called Lawrence Rooks doing the similar thing at Loughborough University here in the UK. So there are people who are trying to do that, but they're trying to verify that. But I'm saying, let's start with something really easy. What job do you do? Can I work out what job you do from your hand? And if you're a good hand reader, you can. Now, if you get that right, what that does is it gives you confidence that your diagnostic method is correct. And so therefore you can be more assured about the other things you're saying, because you've got the kind of cautious approach to that. And that's what unfolds. I mean, the most important thing about a hand reading is that you are able to describe that person's experience to them in a way that makes them feel seen, heard, and understood. That is incredibly therapeutic for that person to be known and understood in that way. And hand reading can do that. And it can do that particularly if you've prioritized the most important things in the hand. And those are the hand shape, the skin texture, the palmar dermatoglyphics, and the fingerprint patterns. And so when I wrote the book in 1991, what I was really doing was repositioning fingerprint analysis to be the central basis for that hand reading process. And that's what's interesting about Johnny. So this book's coming out next year. But people like Johnny have road tested this book for 35 years. That's the basis of his approach to hand reading too, and some of the others that I've already mentioned as well. But he has, so the contents of this book are not just the ideas I came up with in the early 90s, some of which I had to get rid of because I didn't agree with them anymore. But that book has been in the hands of a dozen people who are still practicing hand readers, who've been using that book as a reference for their own practice for the last 30 years, and they've been able to verify and develop those ideas. I mean, there's ideas in Johnny's book. When I read, if I read Johnny's book, I know exactly which bits he's got from my book and which bits he's come from his own experience. And what's interesting to me is not that he's repeated what I've said, but what's interesting to me is, oh, that's a really good idea. Whoa. And that, again, describes my relationship with him, is that he's got lots of experience of reading hands, and so he has lots of insights. And so it's part of that trade. And we still have that trading kind of relationship even now, So, but I think that, to answer your question, I think that how important the fingerprint patterns, I think they are absolutely essential. And that kind of brings us to a kind of a new approach to hand reading, which is not based upon the Victorian palmistry or the astrological palmistry, chiromancy of the medieval Renaissance period. It sort of starts it again. And it's interesting that it starts with Jaquin and it starts with the medical dermatoglyphics, and it kind of builds up from this basis. So I include in the book, all the medical dermatoglyphic stuff in there. So when I was in the Bodleian Library, I also researched all the genetic material on fingerprints and incorporated that into the book. Like Johnny's done in his recent book on health in the hand, he's done a lot of that research as well. And it's funny reading his book because he's read a lot of the same papers that I've read. Oh yeah. But there's a body of literature out there where we can be confident about the medical significance of, say, whorls or loops, like I mentioned earlier on, because that's not palmistry knowledge. That's scientific and validated knowledge that's in a peer-reviewed journal, like the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine or the British Medical Journal or the JAMA or any of those. There's lots and lots of those articles. So we understand that we can be confident in those assertions.
They don't have it within context of the rest of the hand. They're just looking at one thing, aren't they? They're just talking about that.
Yeah, they just look.
You have all this.
They're just looking at. No, they just look at fingerprints. Although they actually also talk about the lines as well. I wrote another book called The Science of the Lines, which is available on my Patreon site if people are really interested. But that's a dissertation on what scientists say about the lines of the hand. So they do mainly only look at fingerprints, but they can't help themselves. I mean, do you know what a simian line is?
Yeah, the straight across the middle.
The simian line is the most important lineal formation that's been studied by medical science. Why? Well, as you probably know, the simian line is incredibly rare. It occurs in about 1 to 2% of people normally, except it occurs in 55% of people with Down syndrome. So it is not the only, but it's one of the most important biometric markers of Down syndrome from the hand. And it's so well known. All nurses, all midwives, they all know about the simian line. And when in a newborn child, they check the hand to see if it's got a simian line. If it's got a simian line, they send the baby off for further genetic testing to test whether it's got Down syndrome or some other very weird chromosomal abnormality, because it's not just Down syndrome that has the simian line. But the reason it's called a simian line is because this formation of the head and heart line joined together is actually extremely common in the hands of chimpanzees and gorillas. Because Western medicine has an evolutionary biological view of humanity, that human beings are evolved out of apes, if a human being is born with a simian line, these two lines fused together, it's like an atavistic sign, a retrospective, but that's where the name comes from. And so it's a completely wrong name, shouldn't be used. Unfortunately, it's the name that sticks. It comes from science. It doesn't come from palmistry. There is no mention of that line in Benham's book, for example, or Cairo's book, they talk about, there's an example in Cairo's book, he doesn't call it a simian line, that's not what he calls it at all. But the notion that it's to do with monkeys is nothing to do with monkey chatter in the Indian tradition. It's to do with this evolutionary biological perspective upon human beings being related to apes, and that line formation occurs more commonly in the hands of apes than it does in the hands of human beings. But when you see that, because they're studying genetic conditions like Down syndrome and Edwards syndrome, Tau syndrome, various chromosome abnormalities, and they're seeing this line again and again and again, they end up talking about it. And so there's actually, in the medical literature about fingerprint patterns, there's an awful lot discussed about the lines, particularly that line, the fused air and water line, or head and heart line, and also the other one where you get this really long extended air line, which they call the Sydney line. That's got nothing to do with Andrew Fitzherbert or anybody else in Australia, apart from Purvis Smith and Mensah, which was a study that was done by some Australian doctors in 1968, where they discovered that line was very common in people who had childhood leukemia. So, but I'm not sure that it really has anything to do with leukemia at all, but the point is they don't really know what they're looking at, but they do look at lines because they've noticed them. And sufficiently that they've actually established the lines are not formed by folding, but they're actually formed by some mechanism of genetics. And yet they never admit that the lines are anything other than folds in the skin. And so this book I wrote called The Science of the Lines is really an essay using their arguments against them to say, no, the lines aren't just folds in the skin, and you said so in that paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. So there's lots of references in that. So yeah, the lines, I'm not dismissing the lines. I'm not saying they're not important, but fingerprints, I think, should be front and center. And that's really what the emphasis in this book is. And where I've been able to draw on the forensic science or the genetics or anthropological science or the medical side of it, I've included all that in the book as well. So that's, there's a whole mixture of those things. And I think that gives it a firm foundation. And then we look at the psychology of the fingerprint patterns, as you asked about, the psychology, the significance of each fingerprint pattern on each finger. And then I go through all the different patterns in the palm as well. And so in reading the book, you get a fascinating study of the whole range of fingerprint patterns, but people can also look at that and find out who they are and what they are. So you can easily identify the fingerprint patterns, and you go through the book and you work out, well, I've got a whirl here and an arch here and a loop there, and what does it mean to have a loop on the thumb? What does it mean to have a tendon arch on the index finger, or whatever it is, and there's a paragraph for each the significance of each fingerprint pattern.
You kindly sent me a copy of the 1991. I had a read through it. I found it fascinating, so I'd highly recommend people get this book when it comes out. It looks really, really good. So, I mean, how do people go about contacting you, looking at what you're doing? What courses are you running? I mean, what's the best sort of contact way to speak to you?
Good question. I can put that up on the screen actually as well. That might be easy to do that since I've got it.
There we go.
Yeah, there's the book. That's the book. That's the book there. That's what it looks like.
Great cover. I like the cover a lot.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I like the cover a lot too. Yeah. That's the contents of the book. It's got, as I said, it talks about the dermatoglyphic terminology, the anthropology, the genetics, looking at the psychological significance of the fingerprint patterns, and then the palmar patterns, and then the medical significance too. And I mentioned John Lennon and Jimi Hendrix and Malcolm X specifically because I've actually included an analysis of their hands in this book, just of their fingerprint patterns, not anything else. Okay. To show you how you can actually do a personality assessment just from the fingerprint pattern, so you don't need to read the lines at all. And also I talk about fingerprint patterns and the karmic significance of them too. So there's a lot of detail. It's about 100 pages. It's 45,000 words.
Wow.
So it'll keep you going.
This is it's one of a kind, isn't it? I don't think I've come across anything like this at all, where you've really gone into that one aspect in such detail. So this should be a real sort of milestone for people that are interested in this particular style of analysis.
Yeah, thank you. Johnny says the same thing. He basically says, there's nothing else out there like this, and I actually plan to write 3 books, and this is kind of I thought I'd start with this one because it's accessible. Even if people don't have any prior knowledge of hand reading, you can actually read this and pick it up really quickly. And I feel confident about what's in this book because it's been road tested for 30 years. But I also feel confident about it because once you're not going to get it wrong. You know, if you can identify the fingerprint correctly, it's the easiest thing in the hand to identify. The lines are really tricky. They're really hard to get clarity about some of the lines, but the fingerprints are relatively easy. You can pre-order the book from Amazon. If you go to Collective Ink, or if you just go to Amazon.com and just search for the name, you can actually pre-order the book if you want to get it, and that will get sent out to you as soon as it becomes available in January.
Fantastic. You've got like a huge resource of stuff on your website as well. If people want to look at that, there's lots of information on there. So
yeah, well, that's all the links are here. So handreading.nz has got my history on it, and it's got some of the text I've written on there as well. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. There's about 100 videos on my YouTube channel as well, and they're designed for various people at different levels. So if you're a beginner, there's some beginner stuff. If you're more advanced, there's more advanced stuff there. And I'm about to start posting a whole lot of stuff on the YouTube channel again. And if you're actually seriously interested in studying hand reading, I mean, all that stuff's for free, but if you want to study hand reading, you can come and join me at Patreon. That's where I do my teaching work. So I have a Patreon site.
Are you doing small groups, one-to-one, or Zoom? I mean, how do you?
I mentor some. I've got some people I'm mentoring on a one-to-one basis. I had 2 students last year. I did a 6 months immersion with them. I usually teach in small groups, and I teach kind of like 6-week courses in a modular form. Probably the best way to find out about that is to go to handreadinginternational.com. That's the website for the International Hand Reading Association. Which the International Hand Reading Association is an organisation that I set up with Johnny and Lynn and Felicity Booth. So that's handreadinginternational.com. Can you see that?
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a kind of overarching association that we put together to kind of work collaboratively with other hand readers. We run conferences. We run conferences twice a year. If you want to find out about the courses, then there's a whole section on diplomas and the contents of those and how they kind of dovetail together. So there's quite a lot of different aspects to that. There's quite a few of us teaching at the moment, and we all work together collaboratively. So we're kind of really trying to bring this approach that I was talking about earlier on, about how Johnny and I were working together in the 90s. We've kind of resurrected that. I came to New Zealand and got married and had children and did other things for 15 years, so that was an important part of my life. But we're at a stage in our lives where we kind of like, I feel like I've got all this information and I need to get it out there. I mean, I've been sitting on it for 30 years, and it's for people who really want to study hand reading and are really seriously motivated to do it, I welcome your interest in studying hands. And it's not easy, and it's hard, there's a lot of thinking that's involved, but if you're interested in doing it, to study with me or with Felicity Booth or with Johnny Fincham, you're learning from people who've got 40 years of hand reading experience, and it's we did all this stuff in the 90s, 30 when we were young men, like young women in our 20s and 30s, and
it's never been a better time to do this now, is it? There's never been so much connectivity and people can really access
it. Exactly. I mean, the fact that I'm in New Zealand doesn't make any difference really. We can do it online these days. So if you're interested, come and check me out on my website or the International Hand Reading Association. I'm sure Andrew will put the links up again if you want to see those. But
will do.
And the Palmistry of Fingerprints. It's a book that's been a long time birthing. So
I'm sure it'll be appreciated. So wrapping things up, thank you, Christopher. Thank you for coming on, speaking to us, and I'm sure people will be in contact if they need more information. And it's really great. Just carry on the great work, keep pumping it out and making this available for people. And I'm sure, like anything, you just find what you're looking for. People will gravitate and find you. Totally find that material.
And to say thank you to you, Andrew, as well. It's been your enthusiasm is infectious, and your curiosity is great as well. So it's been really good having a chat with you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you again.